Quite a few people who watched my video on the P-26P shooter wanted to know what the large aircraft was in this photo, so let's take a look at that now. In 1930, the bomber squadrons operated by the US Army Air Corps mostly consisted of slow biplanes. Designs like the Keystone B-6, LB-12, and the Curtiss B-2 were considered the norm, but these designs were rapidly becoming obsolete. Change was on the wind, and several manufacturers were pursuing the development of new monoplane designs, and one of them was Boeing. Boeing wanted to take the lessons learned from designing their Model 200 Monomail transport and apply them to a twin-engine bomber. The Monomail was their first successful attempt at an all-metal cantilever wing, and it also featured a semi-monocoque fuselage which further improved streamlining. If these same design principles could be applied to a bomber, it could radically improve its performance and thus allow it to evade any potential fighter interception more easily. Today's video technically covers 3 different Boeing designs: the Model 214, the 215, and the 246. However, they are all closely related under the same project. The first 2 were developed together, and then the 246 was developed afterwards, and benefited from lessons learned in the development of the previous 2 models. The first 2 of these aircraft were privately developed by Boeing at their own expense, and the only thing that differed between them was the type of engine they carried. Like the Monomail, and indeed like many new aircraft at the time, these 2 aircraft introduced some modern structural and aerodynamic concepts, but at the same time they also clung to some traditional ideas as well. The Model 214 and 215 would be some of the first big American aircraft to benefit from the use of wind tunnel testing. These tests, conducted by NACA in 1927, had led to the development of a new streamlined cowling for radial engines, and tests also led to the design concept of mounting engines in the front of a single wing in a streamlined nacelle, further proving that you can make bricks fly better if you stick enough curvy bits on them. Boeing's new aircraft would also feature a type of retractable landing gear, another product of wind tunnel testing. Though it was not completely retractable with part of the gear still exposed under the airframe, it still resulted in a reduction of drag overall. The design specifications for these aircraft are relatively similar, with the exception of the different engines, which also resulted in some different speeds and different weights. So, to keep things simple, I shall quote the dimensions and specifications from just the Model 214. It had a length of 56 feet, a wingspan of 76 feet, and an approximate height of 12 feet. It had an empty weight of approximately 8,500 pounds, and a gross weight of 13,600 pounds. In its original design specification, the 214 was powered by 2 12-cylinder liquid-cooled Curtiss Conqueror engines, specifically the GIV 1510C variant. These drove a pair of 2-blade propellers, and gave the 214 a top speed of just over 173 miles an hour, a cruising speed of 147 miles an hour, and a range of 1,250 miles. The aircraft would have a crew of 5. The bombardier, who also acted as nose gunner, occupied a cockpit in the nose, which was equipped with a bomb sight and aiming window at the bottom, and a mount for a flexible machine gun around the top. Because of the narrowness of the fuselage, the pilot and co-pilot occupied tandem cockpits immediately behind the bombardier, instead of sitting side by side in a single wide cockpit as you would see on most other aircraft. A radio station was located ahead of and below them in the fuselage, and a 4th cockpit for a rear gunner was located on top of the fuselage behind the wing. For its size, the aircraft had a light defensive armament, just 2 30-caliber machine guns. That meant just 1 gun for each gunner position, and it also meant that on average this aircraft had 1 or maybe even 2 guns less than contemporary biplane bombers at the time. The bomb load was also relatively light, with 2,200 pounds worth of bombs being suspended under the wings. Again, several contemporary biplane bombers could carry a bit more than that at the time. Along with this small-ish firepower, there was the total absence of consideration for the physical endurance of the crew, for in spite of the great advance in speed over contemporary bombers, all cockpits on the Model 214 and 215 were open cockpits, which would have made for quite the blustery experience at top speed. The higher speeds would result in another innovation, however. The new airspeed increased the loads on the control surfaces, and as a result of this, rudder servo tabs were installed to assist pilots in operating the controls. This was the first instance of this occurring on a completed American aircraft design. On the Model 214, the tab was a small auxiliary surface projecting aft of the rudder trailing edge, and on the Model 215 it was a tall, narrow surface running the full height of the rudder trailing edge itself. The 215 would be the first aircraft built to completion. It was completed in civil colours and markings, and it flew for the first time on April 13th, 1931, achieving a top speed of 163 miles an hour. It was tested by the Army as Boeing's property on a bailment contract under the designation of XB-901. Results from the test were favourable, and the 215, along with the 214, were purchased, with a further order of 5 aircraft for service testing. The basic aircraft design was given the standard Army bomber designation of B-9 when purchased, and the prefix Y was added to indicate the service test status. And so the aircraft could be known as the Boeing Models 215 or 214, the XB-901, or the YB-9, or the Y1B-9, just to keep things nice and simple. The Model 214, originally powered by the Curtiss Conqueror engines, was completed as a military aircraft following the favourable testing of the Model 215. As the 215 had already been designated as the YB-9, the 214 was given the designation Y1B-9, and it made its first flight on the 5th of November 1931. Though faster than the Model 215 when it first flew, it was decided to change the 214 over to radial engines when testing was completed. The Model 215 had recently been refitted with the more powerful supercharged version of Pratt & Whitney's Hornet B engine, and the performance gap had narrowed as a result of this. But the main concern was reliability. The air-cooled radial engines were lighter and more reliable than liquid-cooled engines, and they were less prone to the effects of damage from enemy fire. The 5 aircraft ordered by the Army for testing would arrive as the Boeing Model 246, which would then be designated as the Y1B-9A. The first aircraft flew on July 14th, 1932, and the last was delivered to the Army on March 20th, 1933. As originally delivered, they were outwardly identical to the previous aircraft, with a few minor exceptions. They had the rudder tabs that were used on the Model 214, and their control surfaces had metal instead of fabric coverings. They also now used 3-blade propellers instead of 2-blade, and incorporated some internal structural and equipment changes. These aircraft had an even higher top speed of 186 miles an hour, making them all but impossible to intercept during military exercises in 1932. Despite the increased speeds, they still featured fully open cockpits and gunner positions. Enclosed canopies had been designed at the time of their construction, but for reasons unknown, they were never installed. While these aircraft are one of a group that revolutionized bomber design, they were not the first monoplane bombers developed for the US Army. They were preceded by the Douglas B-7 series and the Fokker XB-8. While both of these designs featured retractable undercarriages, their design concept in general was older than the B-9, both aerodynamically and structurally. Initial Army enthusiasm following the appearance of the Model 215 brought unofficial assurance of sizable production orders, and Boeing believed they had a profitable future with their new aircraft. However, the risks involved in pioneering in a highly competitive industry soon became apparent when Glen Martin Company brought out their own private design. This aircraft was slightly newer in design than the Boeing and had better performance. The Army was impressed, and they awarded large production orders under the designation of B-10 and B-12. This would make the Martin B-10 America's first mass-produced bomber. This signalled the end of the Boeing YB-9. Of the 5 aircraft that were in service with the Army Air Corps, 2 would be destroyed in crashes in 1933, and the remaining aircraft were phased out of service shortly afterwards, with the last being withdrawn in April of 1935.